Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you. You are joining us for our Fine Arts and Collectibles CLE, a timeless passion, heritage, and investment opportunity. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by Elise LeRae and John Oberdorf. My name is Dan Schnapp. I will get to the biographies of our presenters today in a moment. But first, I have to read some obligatory information. First of all, for the benefit of all participants, attendee lines have been muted. Should you have any questions that you would like to submit during the event, you may submit them through the question and answer space. If we cannot address your question during today's webinar, we will follow up after the program. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and circulated to all registrants via email after the event. Should you have any follow-up questions at that time, please reach out to any of the key contacts listed in the email communication. Dentons can only issue CLE credit for attendance during the live broadcast of this webinar. Participation on the live webinar must be on a computer or a laptop device. Credit is not available for joining via mobile device. And one other important note, if you have a New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas license, please be sure to listen for the code word given during the program. And when prompted, you will need to enter the code word into the Q&A section of the screen. If you do not have a license in these states, you can disregard that portion of the message. Without any further ado, I would like to turn to the introduction of our excellent panelists who are joining us today. First, we have Elise LeRae, and Elise is joining us from Heritage Auctions. Elise served as the Vice President Auctioneer and a Department Head of Collectibles for Christie's for more than 10 years after earning her degree in art history from Tulane. Since then, she's collaborated and consulted with a number of specialty auction houses, handling high-profile auctions, ranging from antique toys to sports collectibles and fine wine. The roster of important private collections she has managed includes the archives of Lucasfilms, DreamWorks, Fox Studios, Jimi Hendrix, Muhammad Ali, Eric Clapton, Marilyn Monroe, and Mickey Mantle. She is also the nationally recognized host of numerous television programs on collectibles, such as HGTV's If Walls Could Talk and The Longest Yard Sale, as an appraiser on PBS's Antiques Roadshow, and as a permanent cast member of its popular History Detectives. She earned roles as host of Collection Intervention on the Sci-Fi Network, Treasure Seekers on Boom, and as a collectibles expert on The Nate Berkus Show and Clean House New York, as well as several appearances on morning television programs. She is an author, speaker, and licensed auctioneer in New York, and a member of the Appraisers Association of America, and we are absolutely thrilled that she's able to join us today. And then as well, we have my partner, John Oberdorf, who chairs the U.S. Banking and Finance Group here at Dentons. He focuses his practice on the areas of commercial finance transactions, corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, and intellectual property matters and transactions. John is a highly experienced art attorney. As part of his practice, he is often called to involve himself in very high level and very valuable art transactions. And John has a deep knowledge and deep experience in the area of art law and art transactions. I myself and Dan Schnapp, I am a litigator here at Dentons, a partner in the New York office in the intellectual property and litigation groups. And I specialize, in addition to litigation, in art litigation. And I've been doing so for over 2 decades. So it is a pleasure that you can join us today. Without any further ado, let's go to the next slide, please, Brian, and we'll talk about the agenda.
Dan, by the way, I'm just going to note that you and I are going to have to basically find some ways to get some TV appearances in, so that we can feed those into our bios here. I'm really sort of feeling under-equipped following Elise's bio and sort of, being sort of, on a panel here with a TV celebrity.
It's all about pop culture, John.
Yes.
You can always better. Maybe you could be on Antiques Roadshow too. Today, we're going to talk about provenance of art, and then we're going to turn it over to Elise to talk about passion assets trending today. It's going to be an absolutely scintillating presentation. You're going to learn that comic books can sell for way more than you ever might have imagined. And then I'm going to turn to a topic that's a little bit similar, a little bit different. I'm going to talk about reparation, repatriation, Nazi-looted art, anti-money laundering efforts, and the art market in general, and regulations that may or may not affect the art market. So it's a varied presentation. We're trying to cover a lot of material today. So hopefully you can bear with us. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to the future host of Antiques Roadshow, John Oberdorf.
Thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate the introduction. So listen, most of my slides here are going to sort of discuss one aspect in particular associated with the diligence process around investing in fine art and collectibles, and we'll get to those here in a second. But before I do, and in part because the headline or title of our presentation here today is Fine Arts and Collectibles, a Timeless Passion, Heritage, and Investment Opportunity, I wanted to also maybe just talk about at like a 30,000 foot level, sort of macro level, about investing in fine art and collectibles as an asset class. I think maybe sort of a layperson may not totally appreciate that fine art and collectibles are an asset class, and that people of means and investors are investing in this asset class and view it as an asset class that can produce sort of valuable and meaningful returns over time. Yes, of course, there's the sort of passion asset aspect of this, which is, people love to sort of own and hang on their walls and see every day, a beautiful piece of art. But there's also sort of the dynamic that investing in fine art and collectibles can be a nice sort of part of your overall investment allocation and sort of investment strategy. And to that end, maybe a couple sort of high level points I'll make here. One, there's a fair amount of data that sort of speaks to the fact that fine art and collectibles as an asset class tend to, in fact, outperform the S&P 500 over sort of extended periods of time. In fact, I've seen a number of sort of fairly robust data sets that sort of say that the sort of average annualized rate of return to investors in fine art and collectibles is roughly about 7%. So something to keep in mind when we're sort of talking about art and collectibles here as an asset class. Another thing worth mentioning as it relates to art and collectibles as an asset is that it tends to be for investors a nice diversification play. And that is in part because, again, there's a fairly sort of robust data set that says that as an asset class, fine art and collectibles tend to have very low levels of correlation to like the broader financial markets, and in particular, the public equity markets. So if you're an investor or a person of means, it's a sort of worthwhile sort of asset class for your consideration in terms of allocating some of your wealth and assets to this area. All right. So with that being
John, can I just
said,
add to that for 1 second?
yeah, please.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're having this, we're going to have conversations here, right? Obviously, I agree with you, and I think everybody that's on this call I'll be able to prove John's point as we get further into the slides. However, I would also argue that because it is considered such a strong asset class, that we at Heritage spend a lot of time doing lending proposals, so appraisals. So banks are recognizing this as a true asset and are actually lending large amounts of money against these collectibles. In the last 10 years, if you had looked at it, it would be a contemporary piece of art or an impressionary piece of art that people would be using as collateral. And we've seen a very strong trend towards banks recognizing collectibles as collateral as well, just emphasizing everything that John just said as an asset class.
And Elisa, I appreciate you mentioning that, because as Dan said sort of at the outset, my experience in particular in this area of the market is in basically negotiating transactions involving fine art, collectibles, and in particular, that experience was born out of now sort of over a decade ago, representing a number of the large private banks in doing exactly what you just said, in lending to collectors, and basically taking as collateral a lien over some or all of a given collector's collection of art and or collectibles. And one reason why I mention it here is in a second, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges associated with this asset class. But the fact that there are lenders that are willing to lend money against fine art and collectibles is a very positive and not really recent development, in that it basically is a source of liquidity and provides liquidity to collectors who have a portion of their asset allocation in this area. All right, so with that being said, the next thing I sort of wanted to talk about a little bit at a high level was some of the challenges, if you will, associated with this asset class and investing in this asset class. The first one actually that I wanted to highlight was illiquidity, right? This idea that, fine art and collectibles are not purchased and sold on a, sort of like a registered exchange on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, right? Most of the art market and the transactions occurring in the art market still occur in private sales. At more than 50% occur in private sales. The remainder is typically occurring in public auctions, but even public auctions occur at certain inflection points during the course of a year, at certain locations in the year, etc. So if you are investing in fine art or collectibles, and say you pick an item that appreciates in value, and you want to sort of realize that appreciation by selling the asset, you're going to have to be thoughtful of the fact that it's going to take some time for you to realize sort of the proceeds or the increase in the value of that asset, because the sales don't happen overnight. That's a sort of the nature of the market. I think another thing I wanted to mention is the asset class also tends to come with a fairly high, in terms of sort of, if you're comparing it against value of the asset, a fairly high amount of transactional costs. And that some of those transactional costs are very unique to this asset, right? So you have things like restoration fees, art storage fees. You have insurance. Now, insurance is not unique to this asset, but you have specific insurance that will cover, your fine art and collectibles. And then the last thing I would say, which is going to take us into our slides here, is, listen, the art market is one of the, if not arguably, the most unregulated market that exists. And given that, if you are an early investor or you're someone who's looking to get into this asset class, one, you need to do your homework. And two, as part of doing your homework, that probably means engaging, talking to, working with third-party experts.
Correct.
So with that being said, we'll now go into the body here of my slides. If we can go to the next slide. So one aspect of sort of doing your homework, if you will, as an investor or buyer in the art market or the collectibles market, is this idea of provenance. We have the definition up here. I think the language will sort of speak for itself, but in layman's terms, I sort of describe provenance to sort of people who aren't in the know as, in an ideal scenario, you are trying to establish and sort of through documentation show the path of ownership of a given item of fine art or a collectible from the time of its creation to its current owner and purported seller. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And the reason why you do that and why that is important is, frankly, there are a number of reasons. One, it can go to issues around authenticity, right? If there are long gaps in the provenance, i.e. sort of the chain of ownership of a given item of art, it could potentially be an indication of an item not being authentic. Another thing sort of that feeds into sort of your provenance considerations are issues around value. like any asset, right, there's sort of a risk reward calculus. If a given asset has a well-established and clear provenance history, right, that isn't likely to enhance value, right? There's less risk associated with that asset, with the value ascribed to that asset. And so oftentimes, if provenance history is clear and well established, that's going to sort of increase the value of a given item. Conversely, if provenance history, if there are gaps, that could potentially have a negative impact on a potential item of art that you're considering buying. But I would also tell you that's one of the places where experts like Elise can really add value, right? So say there's an item that's being potentially sort of put out in the marketplace as available for sale and purchase, right? And there may be gaps in the provenance. There you can hire experts to do extensive research and to sort of build out the provenance, i.e. the history of the ownership of the painting, and fill in those gaps to perhaps make what was sort of at first blush a much riskier investment sort of a good deal.
Yeah, and I would also say that the definition of provenance can change. So John's talking about the history of a painting, where it has been exhibited, who owned it, what gallery it was at. Then you also have the provenance celebrity aspect, where you could have a painting. I had recently sold the estate of John Steinbeck. I had a mediocre Picasso piece that normally would sell for $50,000 to $70,000 in etching. And because it was John Steinbeck's, I was able to get 20% more value because it was coming from a famous person. So even though we had all the right provenance, we know who, it was, it's an etching, it's a multiple. The fact that there was this celebrity connotation to it, to its provenance, that can actually add value as well. So there's the history aspect that is super important to value it, to authenticate it. And then sometimes the ownership, if it was in a famous gallery or on a very famous exhibition or printed in a book, or comes from some type of celebrity or famous person, then you're even adding more value to the provenance as well.
Right. Like, I mean, I think one of the things we see all the time, right, is that if a given item has been owned at some point by sort of a well-known and established collector, right, that often really enhances not only the product, but ultimately the value.
The value.
Right? Yeah.
We say at Heritage at least 10 to 20%.
Right. The other sort of the blue circle here speaks to sort of issues around sort of ownership, and like with any asset, basically, right? If you're going to buy fine art or collectibles, ideally, not ideally, you should make sure that basically you are taking, when you pay your money over to the seller, taking clear title to the art. So if there are gaps in the provenance history, there's a possibility that that could sort of evidence the fact that the current purported owner doesn't in fact actually have clear, clean title to the given item. And for example, you could basically pay money for the given item and find out only later down the road that perhaps it is subject to claims of misappropriation. It could be subject to a repatriation claim. And as a pure sort of investor, that's not a place you want to be.
Yes.
Okay, next slide, please. So the point here of this slide is that there is no one piece of information or document that is like the sine qua non or sort of dispositive, if you will, and it sort of firmly and 100% establishes sort of provenance. You're trying to basically build to sort of a comprehensive collective set of documents that sort of establish the history of the given item. There are some things that are certainly better than others. Next slide. In terms of sort of the quality of the document and how helpful or not helpful it is to sort of solve for some of the questions that would typically be raised in a provenance diligence process. Here are some of the reasons why, on this slide, why oftentimes the documentation is less than to be desired, or there are those gaps. Next slide. This talks a little bit about sort of places you can go for different types of records or information regarding a given item of art or a collectible. And Elise, maybe it's worth here talking about, like, so I mean, you'll see a slide later on this, like the broad spectrum of materials that sort of you consider as part of sort of a provenance exercise. Like, for example, I know in the lead up to this, we talked about like catalogs, for example. I think
Well,
it might be worth sort of like talking about those and then some of the other stuff.
Well, I mean, I just really, for time's sake purposes, I would just say to you, auction catalogs and auction records, catalog raisonnés are super important. For, if you have a vintage painting, there's usually catalog raisonnés, which are published to let you know what the person who has passed, what they have published already. There are plenty of things at libraries. The Morgan Library is an excellent example that has the Getty, or not the Getty, the Frick has a wonderful library. There are published lots of public information about older paintings. It's much harder on contemporary paintings. The only thing that I would really say about this when you're doing your due diligence is be very wary of letters of authenticity. They mean nothing to me unless they're coming from an expert that we know is the leading expert in the world. So let's say Calder has, you need to get a letter of authenticity from that institution, but I would be very wary. People write letters of authenticity all the time and they're not real. So in your due diligence, really look for public records because they're really the best.
Thanks. That's a great point. And I would sort of say that sort of availability of public records and documentation is a sort of fairly recent phenomenon, right? Like with sort of the advent of the internet, some
Much
of this
easier.
type of research is
Yeah,
much
much
easier
easier.
and much more widely and publicly available than it used to be,
Right. There's
which
no
really
microfiche
helps. Right,
I
right,
used to go to the library and literally look at microfiche. I don't really have to do that anymore. I
right.
don't know if that might be dating myself here, if anyone even knows what microfiche is, but we don't need to do that anymore.
Thankfully.
All right, next slide, please.
Keep going, yeah, because we're time is here.
And so these are some examples, I alluded to this earlier, of some of the types of documents or information from which you sort of build to a sort of comprehensive, like, provenance sort of picture, if you will. I don't need to sort of talk any more about them, but the point is that you're, again, sort of sourcing materials from a bunch of different places and of different types. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about passion assets trending today. We call them passion assets. Some people like to call them alternative assets. But I just wanted to give you, as John said, some idea as to some of these really strong markets that we find are true, and we're recognizing that banks and others are recognizing that are true assets. Brian, next slide. You heard him start with comics, so we're gonna talk about that really quickly. Heritage last year did over 205 million in sales in comic books. You'll see this painting here, Action Comic #1, first appearance of Superman, sold for $6 million last year. Also last year, this Amazing Spider-Man sold for 1.38. That Spider-Man, just to give you an idea about what John was talking about earlier, the gentleman sold it in the late, I think 1980 to buy a house. He sold it for $40,000, put a down payment on a house in Fort Lee, New Jersey. He recently sold the house for $1 million, and that was his same comic book that sold for 1.3. So the comic book actually sold more than the physical real estate of his investment of his home. One of the things that we have, you'll notice here, are both of these comic books are graded. This is something that's really kind of trended and started taking place. It's been around for a very long time. It's become industry standard for probably about the last 9 years. I think it instills a lot of confidence, and that's what has helped keep this market really strong. There are two third-party trading companies that we use. One is CGC and one is BCCS. You can join as a member. You can submit your comic beforehand. You do have to pay for it. Heritage does get a major discount because we do the most volume in the world in comic books. The comics are charged based on the insurance value. So you don't have to pay, if you have a book that's really $400 or $1,000 for Heritage, if it's $3,000 or less, we charge $10,000. I mean $10. So we're not charging you $1,000 for a book that's $3,000. If you have an insurance value of something that's $20,000, it's 4% of the fair market value. So it just kind of makes it in proportion as to what the piece is worth. But it has instilled a lot of confidence. They're graded on their condition, and it really helps. It has given us a standard on what to expect for pieces. Next slide. And just to give you an example, so we submitted a Hulk #1 actually yesterday to the CGC. We thought that it would grade at $15,000, so we put an insurance grade of $15,000 on it. They came back to us and said, there is no restoration as you thought on this piece. This piece is pure. It's worth $500,000. So we're going to charge you a different percentage of what we think. We're going to charge you based on that $500,000, and it will most likely sell for about $750,000. The last Hulk #1 that we sold at auction with no restoration sold for $750,000. So they are fair. They didn't put $750,000 on it. They put $500,000 on it. When we were wrong, we thought there was restoration, and there wasn't. Comic books are so strong that it leads to other categories for us. So comic art has become, again, another class category that we're doing lending upon, and we're selling over $100 million worth of property. That then reflects into illustration art. So we are now the leaders in Norman Rockwell, Line Decker, anything for the Saturday Morning Post. So they all kind of, parlay each other into just building more and more and more collectibles for people. This is an illustration piece from a comic art, and it sold for $840,000. Down below, you'll see why I brought this in just because it's interesting. We're seeing not only Marvel and DC, which are extremely popular because of the movies. We're now seeing pulp art. We're seeing Disney. We're seeing Looney Tunes. We're seeing The Simpsons. It's just expanding and expanding and expanding on all different categories that we just. We cannot sell enough of them. We have weekly auctions of comics and monthly auctions of higher end comics, and then another tier of comics that we sell throughout the year.
Hey, Elise, how important is it that if someone is bringing a comic book of this vintage to Heritage, that it be in pristine condition?
It's not that important, but condition does really play a big role on how much something is worth. So we do sell comics that are ungraded. We'll just say to you, it's not worth it getting graded, but that's usually if we're taking in a large collection. So we really look at everything as a whole. We can't sell something that's falling apart, but if you're worried about it, we'll tell you right away if we think it has value or not, even in whatever condition it's in. Next slide. Another asset category for us that's extremely important, and we are the leaders in, is sports memorabilia. Last year, we did over $200 million in sports. We're already set to break that. This is a really good example of beating every market there is. When I worked at Christie's in 1994, a gentleman named Al Rosen came in and said, I have this 52 Mickey Mantle Topps rookie card. It's a 9.5, which was the highest that we had ever seen. You can just look at it here on the screen and see how sharp the corners are, how perfectly centered it is, how great the color looks on it. It's just fantastic. He walked around he had this little case, and he called it, Mr. Mint, and he had it in a briefcase. And at Christie's at the time, we sold it for a record-breaking $50,000. Last year, we sold this comic for $12.6 million. So you do the math on the capital gains on that one. An interesting thing that happened to us during COVID is that we saw that not only vintage cards, 52 Mickey Mantle is still considered kind of a vintage card, but we saw contemporary cards from the 70s and the 80s starting to gain true value and traction. We, in that year, sold a let's see, a Brady, a rookie Brady card, a Gretzky card, and a Jordan card. So you got hockey, basketball, and football. Never before would you ever even see them getting any good value, and all of them sold for over $1 million each. So again, a tremendous growth in this category, is specifically in baseball cards. But again, vintage baseball. I'm sorry if you're not a Yankee fan, but I could sell Yankee memorabilia from the 20s and the 30s all day long. Give me Babe Ruth all day long, and I could him, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio. I could just sell it nonstop, and it always goes up in value.
Hey, Lise, let me ask you a question, and for the benefit of our audience here. I've seen a fair amount of coverage in sort of a number of the trades and newspapers that the fine art market certainly last year was down, and values were down, and volume of transactions were down. But the collectible space is really taking off and has been sort of a bright spot. Right.
Correct.
And I guess I'd be curious to hear sort of your thoughts on what's sort of feeding into that, why
so I
that
think
is.
It's twofold. One, it's a passion asset, so this is something that people love, that you and I said. Two is it's affordable. Obviously, we're talking, there's plenty of things that I'm selling over $1 million, but you could buy a baseball card, you could buy a game used bat, you could buy a single signed baseball, you could buy a comic book, you can buy an autograph of John F. Kennedy for a couple $1,000s. So there is a really good entry point. And what Heritage has done, I mean, we sit and have conversations about how can we bring Generation X, and how can we bring the millennials in, and how can we get them into collecting. We sell movie posters, we sell video games. We really try to get them in. Urban art has gotten them in, and once they get the collecting bug, they start to collect. We cross market them to other. We're very good at cross marketing to other categories, and I think it's the entry level point of getting these in, and you can collect them, that has been super helpful to us.
That's interesting.
We have not seen a down. We have not seen anything. We haven't seen these categories go down yet.
Got it. Because Dan and I earlier in the year sort of gave a talk where one of the things we talked about was sort of this idea of like the democratization of sort of fine art as an asset class. And we talked about how sort of like historically the sort of entry price point was problematic. And it would seem that sort of from a collectible standpoint, that's a real benefit.
I think it's a real benefit. I agree. I think what Heritage does, I mean, listen, Christie's and Sotheby's and Phillips do an amazing job selling extremely high-end art. We do an amazing job selling middle market.
Okay, interesting.
Which has really helped us in these categories. So let me just keep going, because there's a couple more categories I just want to talk about quickly. Brian. So the next category, I could talk about this. We don't have that much time. So this is the Wizard of Oz. It is obviously it's the ruby slippers, the most iconic piece of vintage Hollywood memorabilia. The Natural Museum of History has a pair. It's the most sought after item at the Natural Museum of History. There were multiple pairs made. I sold a pair when I was at Christie's in the 80s for $100,000, and then resold them in my last year at Christie's for $1 million. This pair was another pair that a gentleman, Michael Shaw, bought directly from a Warner Brothers auction, toured it around the United States, got stolen, and was found last year. So we were able to help him after it got stolen, and it sold for $32.5 million. It sold in December. I watched the sale with my parents. They were in shock. There were 4 people bidding from about 15 million up until about 28. So it wasn't just 2 people going at it. There were multiple people from all over the world going after this pair. And then when you go to the next slide, I find this super interesting. The Heritage teamed up with HBO. This year, you'll see Walking Dead is coming up. We had Succession last year. Everything in these contemporary entertainment sales, because they are contemporary. This sale of the Game of Thrones, everything started for $100. This is a touring Iron Throne. It wasn't even used in the actual series. It was used to promote the series. It sold for $1.2 million. And here's just one of Jon Snow's many outfits that we sold. This one was worn during the Night Watch, $337,000. This is the biggest growing area for us right now at Heritage. I recently have,
Are there any specifically kind of unusual provenance issues that come up when you are dealing with memorabilia or articles of various sorts from Hollywood? So, for example, with the ruby red slippers, they dated to the 1930s. I don't know how many owners they had, but is there anything unusual when they emanate from Hollywood as opposed to something else?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about this, my next slide, but it took us a long time to authenticate the ruby slippers because there's so many fakes out there. It just so happens that he did have provenance, that he bought it from the Warner Brothers Museum. But a lot of people come to us and say, I have something. You have to prove it. And when we get to a couple other slides, I'm going to show you how we do that. Next slide. Just to remind people that jewelry and timepieces, again, super collectible. I'm not going to waste my time on that one because let's go to the next one. Handbags is another luxury department that we have found that it's continued to grow. It's very common for us to do an appraisal of $1 million or more for Birkin bags. Chanel has gone up in value because the contemporary bags that they sell in the store have gone up in value. Next slide. We are selling crypto. This sale right now is going on. The bids are actually already higher than when I made this slide. I think they're at 50 and 100. I can't talk a lot about it because I don't know that much about it. But what is happening in these one is there is something there is a physical representation of these Bitcoins. It's called the Cassius coin. So there are physical coins as well, but we're doing extremely well in this area. And it is an area that we will be following just to see if it's a steady climb. So far, so good. And traditionally, if you go to the next slide, Brian, we do sell gold and coins. We're the leaders in it in the world. We do over $500 million a year in it. Always, I do loans constantly on gold and coins. Next slide. Daniel? Dan?
Yeah, this is my part here. So obviously, if you are paying attention, you will see that there is a code word up on the screen. And as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we need to take a brief moment to satisfy CLE requirements by delivering the following code word. All Kansas, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania licensed attendees must type the code word ART, very imaginative, into the Q&A section of your screen. Please make sure to hit the send button so that it registers in case you missed it the first time. Again, the code word is ART, A-R-T. Sorry, Elise, please.
No worries. Thank you, Brian. Okay, so here's the difference that Dan just asked me about. How do you authenticate something that doesn't have all the bells and whistles that John talked about? It doesn't have paperwork. It might not have a bill of sale. It doesn't have auction records. It doesn't have a catalog raisonné. It doesn't have this great letter from this expert. What do you do? This person claimed that they had the 1932 Babe Ruth game-worn jersey from the famous shot called Around the World. And this is how we do it. And I just thought I'd just it's not easy. You need experts. The very first thing we do is we look at the jersey. This jersey was constructed of heavy gray flannel that was very consistent during the time period of the road jerseys of that area. The midnight navy, where it says New York, and the way that it was arched across the chest with Roos number 3 on the back was exactly the way that it should be. The interior collar had Spalding label formatted by the Spalding Company, exactly how it was formatted from 1926 to 1933. There were no size markings in that because during that time period, there shouldn't be. So a lot of times people give us something and I see it, this is from this year and I see automatically, I know it's not right because there's a size on it. Immediately to the left of where it says Ruth, GH, it was embroidered in, which was the manner that they did. That's how they put people's names in there. The tag on the back of the jersey, we were able to authenticate that as well. The size of the jersey, we measured it. It was a size 46, which was his frame. In 32, Babe Ruth actually became a little heavier as he drank a little bit more. So believe it or not, his size changed. The pearl buttons, you'll see they're emphasized in the photograph. They were really important. The way that they were even, the distance between any of them, we could tell that it was real. And there was this thing that Babe Ruth had called a tie down fat strap. And that was to keep it tucked in. A lot of people don't know about it, but in the rear of the jersey, sometimes they had this fat strap. So there was one there. So that again helped us just by looking at this jersey intrinsically. You know, is this a real jersey? We were able to tell just from that this was a time period jersey. We did send it out to a company to authenticate. There is a third party as well that authenticates jerseys. But after we intrinsically were able to figure out was that this was a period jersey, which is super important, we were able to use something called a photographic match. Now, there are companies out there now that do photographic matches for you. And because he wore this in multiple games around that time period, there was a pre-game photo of him. There was a photograph afterwards when he was on a home base. There was a second, there was, a couple of publicity. There was an end of the match photo. So there were so many photographs from that day, and actually from an earlier game that he wore that in like June 9th or something like that. So there are multiple photographs that we were able to get up close and through technology today to even match the cotton. And that was able to prove to us that this was the jersey that he wore when he called the shot. And lastly, as John talked about earlier, we look at provenance. Where did it come from? Well, it came from somebody who was a well-known collector for many years. He's since passed. I knew him for 30 years. So it came from a very famous collection. He had gotten it from a woman whose husband worked for Babe Ruth and was a golfing buddy of his. So he had a letter from her saying that he had given it to her husband at that time period. Babe Ruth was known to give out some of his jerseys, so it had great provenance, and it sold for $24 million at auction. Similar to that, in the next slide, you'll see that when I was working for History Detectives for PBS, a woman came to us and said, my father has this guitar, and he said it's Bob Dylan's guitar when he went electric at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. Now, again, folklore. Okay, here we go. People tell me this all the time. But her father was a pilot, and during Woodstock and during the Newport Folk Festival, he was the pilot that a bunch of different Crosby, Stills and Nash, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan used to take airplanes to fly in and out of these concerts. He left it on her father's airplane. 20 years later, she kept contacting the Dylan camp after the statute of limitations went out. She was allowed to start looking into it. First thing we did was examine it. Was it a Sunbest fender from that time period? Literally, I took it apart, found the serial number inside. That serial number dated to 1964. That was good. Then it was sitting in a case that said Ashes and Stone. That was handwritten on it. Ashes and Stone, turned out by going into research, I was able to find out that was his production company. And you would only know that if you found a check that was made out to Bob Dylan or an invoice from Bob Dylan. It also came with these 12 pages of handwritten lyrics and typewritten lyrics, which he was known to do. I don't know if any of you recently saw the movie, but in the movie, he's constantly writing down things. But I was able to match his handwriting from the Morgan Library to some stuff that he has donated from the library. It's a complete perfect match. And then we did, again, a photo match. I found a person who was a photographer at the time that was in the pit. We blew up the photographs that he took, and we could match the wood grain to this guitar. So again, no paperwork, no letters of authenticity, no catalog raisonné, complete family folklore. What do you do? And those are the steps that we took, and it recently sold for over $1 million. Lastly, next slide. Just a really quick note that what we do, because some of these things have become so important, we are able to help charities. Eric Clapton came to me when I was actually started at Christie's and we moved it to Heritage. He had a bunch of guitars, and he had 200 guitars, and he's like, I want to open up Crossroads, which is going to be my center in Antigua. And I thought, oh God, how are we going to sell 200 guitars? And they went through the roof. We have continued to now do that at Heritage. This guitar here sold for $32,000. We sold a Blackie for $1 million, a Brownie for over $1 million. We've raised multiple $1 million for him for charity. This is just an example of an estate that came to us with jewelry. The Communities of Texas, again, another asset that they couldn't use that we were able to use to help them sell to raise money. We recently did it with the Nobel Peace Prize from the Ukraine to raise money for the Ukraine. So we can take these assets that are not paintings, are not normal assets, and figure out a creative way to not only, you know, lend money on them or use them to, you know, diversify a portfolio, but we can help people with charitable endeavors as well.
And Elise, maybe just one thing to add. I will tell you that this slide made me think, like, this is sort of a common sort of inflection point where folks like Dan and I get involved with owners or collectors of fine art and collectibles. Because what my experience has been is oftentimes you'll have maybe a wealthy family whose parents sort of had a certain taste, right? Maybe they really liked impressionist paintings and have sort of developed over their lifetime a collection sort of of paintings of that type in that era. And maybe haven't sort of planned for what happens when they pass away, and their children may not be sort of interested in impressionist painting. And so one of the common sort of ways that Dan and I get involved is when sort of estates are trying to figure out, sort of as part of their larger estate planning process, you know, what to do with those types of assets. You know, say the kids basically say, like, that's not my taste, I don't want to keep it, we want to sort of liquidate it. Well, you know, there's sort of a strategy about, you know, how you go about doing that to sort of realize, for the benefit of the estate, you know, the most amount of money possible. And usually that also includes probably making certain sort of charitable contributions to charities.
Yes, and let me just advise you as well. I think it's an excellent conversation for people to have with their clients. I recently had a situation where a gentleman wanted to leave to University of Michigan, or left to University of Michigan, a beautiful Warhol that he wanted it to be hung in a certain spot at the University of Michigan, with the caveat that it could never be sold. So when the family was looking for that donation, I wasn't able to put a value on it because it has no value. If it is not going to be sold, it has no assets to the organization. So that's where Heritage, or, you know, we come in to work with people like you guys so that we could talk to you before that, you know, terrible decision was made. I mean, not that it's terrible, because I'm happy that University of Michigan has it, but the family certainly did not get that benefit.
That's right. And the adage there that we would sort of, you know, when we're counseling people is plan ahead. Have conversations with the next generation about sort of your collection, what the intent is to do with it when you sort of pass on, et cetera. And certainly to avoid some of those types of situations.
Okay, let's get to the next slide if we can. Elise, thank you so much. And now we're going to get super heavy again for a few minutes. Hopefully leave a little time at the end for some questions. So I hope that everyone understands that we're talking about art as a very wide and varied topic. Obviously, there's valuation, provenance, and then, of course, there's some other things that affect the art market in general. First, I'm going to start talking a little bit about Nazi-looted art and its legacy, and then I'm going to move forward and talk a little bit about repatriation, some litigation issues, and how money laundering and anti-money laundering endeavors affect the market as a whole. So I hope that everybody who is on this presentation is aware that during World War II, approximately 650,000 pieces of art were looted from Jewish citizens in Europe. And the Nazi forces did this systematically in order to not only confiscate the art, but to fund their war effort and to promote their own ideology, with an idea of trying to create some form of, as they called it, grand collection of classical art for some kind of super museum, while destroying what they believed to be degenerate art. And so obviously this has been a tragedy that we've been trying to address since the conclusion of the war, and there have been all kinds of efforts. One of the most significant efforts, let's go to the next slide. One of the most significant efforts was that the Office of Strategic Services, which, let's go to the next slide, please, Brian. the Office of Strategic Services, which as a matter of trivia became the CIA, established the Art Looting Investigation Unit. There were other organizations, and there continue to be organizations today that are dedicated to the spirit of trying to recover these artworks. In fact, these efforts are ongoing, and there are organizations today such as the Claims Conference and the American Alliance of Museums that make this their mission and priority. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in trying to recover lost and looted art, obviously one of the most significant legal issues that claimants face and families face and heirs face is a statute of limitation. Obviously, the war ended in the 1940s, but there have been multiple efforts over the years for the courts and the legislatures to provide opportunities for people to be able to go out and to, within a relevant statute of limitations, claim the ability to have their work returned to them. One of the most significant ones is what you're looking at here, which is known as the HERE Act. It's the Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act of 2016, might be the most preeminent law that governs these situations, and it was intended to establish a uniform federal statute of limitations and override any state claims that might have barred these claims for lost and looted art. And in fact was intended to go directly to the heart of the shortcomings of efforts to recover Nazi looted art. So it's a 6-year statute of limitations. It applied to cases pending or filed after its enactment, but it has a sunset date of January 1, 2027. Let's go on, please. So the anti-money laundering and the art market aspect of this is also a sort of a critical component of what we're dealing with today. They're really, as John said earlier, this is a gigantic market. It has really very little regulation. It's believed that approximately $2 trillion worth of art is laundered annually. I'm sorry, money is laundered annually, which is roughly about 5% of the gross domestic product. And the art market, which represents approximately $65 billion, is particularly vulnerable because it is, in fact, the largest, most unregulated industry in the United States. So over the years, there have been multiple efforts to try and control the lack of regulation of the art market, to address it as one of the largest black markets in the world, and to try and bring a stop to people who have nefarious objectives from utilizing the art market as a means of trying to transfer assets illegally. Let's go to the next slide, please. One of the most important things that people should be aware of is that, in fact, while AML regulations exist for many aspects of commerce in the United States, and while they are deemed as being crucial for detection and prevention of fraud and money laundering, they don't necessarily apply to the art market, although I'll get to it in a moment. They actually do apply in part to the antiquities market. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the Bank Secrecy Act is one of the principal pieces of legislation that mandates that financial institutions implement anti-money laundering programs. However, again, it does not apply to the art market. And though the definition of financial institution has expanded over time to cover non-bank entities such as real estate, pawnbrokers, and everything in between, still doesn't cover the art market. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the BSA, as it exists, has 5 pillars: designation of a compliance officer, development of internal AML policies, proper employee training programs, regular independent risk-based audits, and implementation of customer due diligence. Now, there have been multiple efforts over the years to apply the BSA to the art market. There have been acts known as the Illicit Art and Antiquities Trafficking Prevention Act, which was introduced in 2018, which would have amended this to classify dealers in art or antiquities as a financial institution. That would have made KYC programs applicable to art transactions, but the law did not pass. A lot of people in the art market felt that it was unduly burdensome on some of the smaller art market participants. There's also, in 2021, Congress passed the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, and it directed a Department of Treasury arm to examine the art trade to determine whether or not the BSA should also cover the art market. And a 2022 study, which has become fairly famous now among us art litigators, acknowledged the risk of abuse in the high value art market. It ultimately recommended prioritizing other sectors like real estate and other aspects of commerce rather than the art market. So as of now, there still is no American law that effectively controls anti-money laundering within the art industry. Let's go to the next slide. So I talked about these. I also should mention the Enablers Act and establishing new authorities for business laundering and enabling risks to security still does not apply to the art market. Next slide, please. Unlike the US, the EU and the UK have been much more aggressive. They've been much more successful. In 2020, the EU enacted the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which extended AML regulations to include art auction houses and dealers. And as of today, however, US AML laws lag far behind these laws. And this has become increasingly problematic given that the US is not only the largest global art market with roughly 42% of the global share, but in comparison to some of the other major economies in the world, it even seems larger than that. So China is at 19%, the UK is at 17%. So it is a very attractive playground for people who wish to launder their money. Not that I'm recommending that. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there is obviously efforts to require financial institutions to implement robust compliance programs, but as of today, there is no law that actually makes it a crime or even impose civil liability if you don't do so. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to close and hopefully leave a few minutes to get to some questions. I started by talking about the Nazi looting. I talked a little bit about anti-money laundering, and I also want to mention a sort of a broader process of, even if it's a stolen antiquity or something else that wasn't necessarily related to World War II, there are efforts all the time, all over the world, to repatriate cultural property to its rightful owner. And there are many different things that can play into this, whether it be a statute of limitations, whether it could be an effort to ferret out whether or not it's been the product of crime. But at the end of the day, as we will end with the way we started, and that provenance often turns out to be the most important aspect of art law, which is tracing the history of the ownership of an object, whether it be a comic book, a Matisse, a John Steinbeck novel, or anything else. So hopefully that was useful and interesting. And before we close, I'm going to try and see if we can get to one or two questions. And I have one here, and I'm going to offer it first to Elise if she wishes to answer. Elise, this is the question. If I own an original Warhol painting of Mick Jagger, and there were only 7 originals, how would the other independent valuations for the other 6 paintings affect my independent evaluation that I plan to obtain in the future? So I think the question is, if I understand, you're on mute, by the way, I think the question is really, do independent evaluations for other paintings affect an evaluation for one that you wish to put up for auction?
Well, not an evaluation, a selling price would affect it. First, let me just say that if it's a Warhol painting of a Mick Jagger, I think what they're talking about is a print. There is a series of Mick Jagger and Warhol prints that are signed by both Warhol and Mick Jagger. We sell them all the time at Heritage. I don't know of 7 originals with serial numbers. That right there is a red flag to me. That doesn't really make sense. But if they have 7 paintings, I don't know why Warhol would do 7 paintings of Mick Jagger. I don't know. Something doesn't sound right there. But let's just, to answer the question, if they were 7 original Mick Jagger paintings from Warhol, it's really the selling prices that we take into effect, not what anybody can appraise anything for any price. It means nothing to me. If you're doing a USPAP compliant appraisal for the IRS, anything over $50,000, you have to use comps very similar to real estate. You have to explain why you can't, why you came up with that price. You have to do a scope of work and a detailed analysis of why you're coming up with that price. So it really is the selling price and what the market is entailing. It is not what other appraisers are putting of appraiser, if that's the question. My guess is, I mean, even if they were Mick Jagger's, signed by both Warhol and Mick Jagger prints, they usually do sell for over 50 grand. So we would be using comps.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and maybe I would add something here, right? Is like an appraisal process has a number of like data inputs that feed into that process, and precedent transactions, right? In terms of like what willing buyers would pay for a similar sort of item is a great data point. I think the reason I was sort of wanted to jump in here is the other thing that Dan and I have seen in our practice here, right, is that I think oftentimes buyers or collectors will sort of receive appraisals, and based on those appraisals have a belief as to sort of an underlying sort of value for an item that is not sort of really a good independent appraisal. Perhaps the appraisal was provided by the gallery that sold the painting to the owner. Now, I'm not sort of trying to sort of ascribe sort of any sort of negativity towards galleries. That they're business owners and typically are people of high integrity. But you can see that how if I'm a gallery owner and I'm selling you a painting, and then I'm also providing you an appraisal that sort of speaks to the price point at which I'm selling you that painting, that there's an inherent conflict of interest there.
Well, and
So-
it's not USAP compliant, so you wouldn't be
Right.
able to use that for a loan or for the IRS or a tax appraisal, because that's completely against regulations for the standard practices. I also would encourage you, if that is the case, to look at the definition of the value. If you're looking at any appraisal and they're not defining how they use that value, that's a red flag right there. And often, as John is speaking, they're giving you the retail, which is replacement value, which is not fair market value. And we see this the most with jewelry. People come in when somebody dies and thinks they have this huge estate of jewelry, and it's 30% on the dollar because they have these high replacement values on that jewelry estate. So John is completely right. You have to look at the appraisal, see where it's coming from, make sure there's a definition of value. And then if there are selling comps, not listing comps of what somebody is asking for it.
Great. Thank you so much, Elise. Thank you so much, John. You guys have been awesome panelists. And I just want to close by saying that thank you again for participating in today's CLE. And 30 business days, you'll receive an email with a link to your CLE certificate. Your webinar login details will be used to process these certificates. No additional steps are required. As a reminder, the code word requirement is only if you're seeking credit in Kansas, New York, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania. I want to say thank you again to Elise. Thank you again to John. And please feel free to follow up with any questions you may have. We hope you have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys. Thanks for having me.